Alright, so it looks like we're up first here, and a weird hand. I think I want to keep it, but obviously only one spell. But we do have 4 lands, 3 spells, and this deck has a good amount of card filtering. We are going to be hoping we're playing up against some sort of a creature-based deck. Fiery Impulse is a card I like against the humans decks, and that's one of the reasons why it's here. So we'll see exactly what our opponent's doing in a minute. But in the dark, I like keeping this hand. If we knew we were up against a control deck, we would certainly want to mulligan. And so here's a forest. Interesting. That could mean ramp. Ramp is the worst matchup for the Goggles deck, so that would potentially be bad news. And yes, actually, we are playing against ramp. So our opponent did play a 2-drop, so let's just go ahead and get rid of it. Ramp doesn't normally play that many creatures that you can target with Fiery Impulse, so it's pretty fortunate there that our opponent actually cast one. And hopefully our opponent continues to cast creature-based ramp rather than actual ramp spells, because the actual ramp spells are what's going to beat us. But there's another creature we can kill and then go ahead and follow up with a Pia on our turn. So let's go ahead and do that. And here we go. And we haven't seen red from our opponent yet, so this could just be straight mono green ramp, or it could be that our opponent does have red mana for something like Kozilek's Return. But Pia's been a pretty nice one-up for me in this deck. Just a 4-mana creature that can put pressure on your opponent in a number of ways, really. And we'll see what our opponent decides to do about this particular situation. Something like Explosive Vegetation would be optimal from our opponent's side here. And that is going to be the play, so that means if our opponent is getting mountains, this is all of a sudden a setup for Chandra. It could be a setup for World Breaker, or even Ulamog potentially moving forward with both of those shrines. Unfortunately, we don't have the flexibility to play around all of those cards, so we're just going to go ahead and start getting in some damage. We can get in for 8 this turn, so we can at least start to apply some pressure on our opponent. But like I said, this is one of the worst matchups for the Blue-Red Goggles deck, especially when we don't have a Thing in the Ice. Thing in the Ice is one of the ways that we can really put enough pressure on our opponent, but unfortunately we don't have one this game. We do have access to Eldrazi Obligator after board, which is quite good against ramp, as well as Negate. So we'll have some options. But our opponent's draw looks to be pretty solid, assuming that one of the big haymakers is going to come down. And Oath of Nissa can find one of those haymakers right here. And with the Sanctum of Ugin and the Chandra Flamecaller that our opponent just revealed, things are not looking good. Our opponent's pretty likely to play Chandra and tick it down to get rid of our squad. Then our best draw step is going to be our own Chandra if we can peel one. Otherwise, we're pretty likely to just go ahead and attack Chandra to at least get it off the table, to live another day, and to take another turn in the game. But if our opponent does have something like a World Breaker or Ulamog, likely that's going to be too much to handle. But in any case, we haven't really drawn much gas. We kept a 3 Fiery Impulse hand. We've only drawn 1 spell since then. So that's pretty unusual. This deck does play a lot of lands, but even so, still a lot of spells that are left in our deck. So let's go ahead and take Chandra out. And we'll see what our opponent has next for us. So effectively, when we're looking at the shrines, we see 4, 6, 9, which means only 1 land away from Ulamog. And a World Breaker would allow our opponent to sacrifice the Sanctum to find that Ulamog. It looks like Oath of Nissa is still digging for those big threats for our opponent. Hopefully, from our point of view, those threats are not found, but unfortunately, World Breaker is very bad news. And that was the card that our opponent is revealing off of this Oath of Nissa. So, World Breaker is likely to take out one of our blue-red lands, and if our opponent finds Ulamog with the Sanctum, we're really looking at circumstances that are going to be very difficult to deal with. And so, yep, there's the 5. And, yep, okay. Just what we thought, and we'll see if our opponent sacrifices the Sanctum to get Ulamog, or possibly get another copy of World Breaker. And yeah, it's going to be actually just a second World Breaker. That's the more conservative line if our opponent doesn't have more lands. And we have all lands, so not too much to be done here, but we'll just pass the turn and take another draw step. But, oh, there's another Sanctum, so it looks like our opponent is gonna pretty much have this game locked up with another World Breaker here, and then the Sanctum is gonna be sacrificed for probably a third World Breaker even. And so, yeah, there's not really any outs we have at this point. So, let's just go on to the next game. So, here we are on the play. Fevered Visions is a card we can look at as a way of closing out the game. So we can sort of transition into a very different style deck with boarding in negates. We have the Visions. Now we can also board in the Obligators. And we can try to mise out a win, essentially. We can take out a lot of our spot removal. Goggles itself, in fact, is not even very good in this matchup. So I'm actually fine with taking out the Goggles themselves, because we're cutting a lot of our red spells, and our opponent has World Breaker in order to get rid of Goggles. So yeah, let's just go ahead and go with this, and we'll try to essentially blitz our opponent out this game. Alright, let's see if we can get an aggressive draw here. And we do have a Visions, so yeah, let's try it. We have an Obligator and we have a Visions. And it looks like our opponent's taking a mulligan, so can't ask for too much more. The matchup, once again, is tough, but we are on the play with a decent draw. Optimally, though, we would have a 2-drop like Jace, or even better would be Thing in the Ice. We don't have either, although we did just draw Jace, so we can play Jace. And next turn, we're going to just go ahead and play Fevered Visions, most likely, just to try to chip away at our opponent's life total as quickly as possible. Although, the other option is just playing Jorian and not even worrying about the Fever Visions because our opponent could be stuck on lands, potentially. So let's just go ahead and play the Jorian, and we can just leave the Visions in hand, and we'll see what our opponent plays here, and that will help dictate whether we want to play our Fever Visions next turn. But I actually like playing Jorian here because there's not that much our opponent can do to interact with Jorian, except potentially Chandra later in the game. So Jorian can do quite a bit of work. And the Fever Visions is a nice card, but it also allows our opponent to draw cards. And that's not something we really want to be doing right now. So let's see if this is going to be some sort of a ramp spell or what exactly is going on. So it's actually Rending Volley. That's going to take care of Jorian, although it does mean that Jace is still in play. So that's good news. And let's go ahead and loot with Jace now. And we can just go ahead and discard this Fiery Temper and use it to deal our opponent 3 damage. And now we're at the stage where, yes, it's time for us to go ahead and play the Fevered Visions, even though it is likely going to mean our opponent is going to have a smoother draw overall. So this could be something like an Explosive Vegetation, which would be the best card our opponent could play from their perspective. Kozilek's Return, though, is decent as it gets rid of our Jace. Although now our opponent's taking 2, and we can just go ahead and continue on this Fevered Visions plan by playing a second one. And our opponent may just die to these 2 Fever Visions. And, okay, so it looks like we've got a bunch of negates. We'll see if those negates are going to be useful. We are a little short on lands here, having just missed our land drop for the turn. But since our opponent is just playing Oath of Nissa here, it's likely our opponent's going to be taking another 4 damage from these Fever Visions. Okay, there's the 2-drop creature. But, yep, here's the Fevered Visions. And it looks like our opponent's going to be going down to 11 now. So we drew Magmatic Insight, which is actually a pretty bad draw because we don't have lands to discard to it. So we could go ahead and play a Tormenting Voice. We could play Jace. Both of those options are pretty solid here. Let's go ahead and go with the Tormenting Voice just because we really do want to try to hit our land drop here. And we can go ahead and get rid of this Magmatic Insight. Alright, so we drew into a land plus another Jace. So we can just simply pass the turn here and sit on these negates, which I kind of like. Unfortunately, we're going to have to discard something, and we don't really want to let our opponent know what's going on. in terms of the fact that we have all these negates. So we're just going to discard a Jace here. So there's the World Breaker, which is pretty good. We'll see what our opponent actually goes ahead and takes out. And it's going to be a Fevered Visions. This does open up the door for us to play our Eldrazi Obligator, though, and deal our opponent 8 damage here. We can also return our Drownyard Temple to play, so let's go ahead and do that so we don't forget. And so, yep, our opponent's now down to 9. And let's just go ahead and take this opportunity to play our Eldrazi Obligator and steal the World Breaker. And it looks like our opponent's probably not happy about this sequence. The game's not completely over, but things are looking pretty good for us. We do know, though, that our opponent has another World Breaker, which is going to be pretty good because it can take out our Fevered Visions, which means we may need to draw another burn spell in order to win the game. Unfortunately, our opponent hasn't really given us an opportunity to make full use of these negates, and we've drawn 4 copies, which is quite a lot of negates to have drawn. We're really looking here for Fall of the Titans or Fiery Temper to close this game out. Those are the 2 cards that we really want. We're going to get a draw here off our Fevered Visions, and we'll see if that can help us. Pia was actually a card I wasn't thinking about, but that may be enough to do it because we can play Pia, get our 2 Thopters, sack a Thopter, and ping our opponent for the last 2 damage of the game. So, yeah, here's that second World Breaker going after the Fevered Visions, which makes perfect sense from our opponent's point of view, but we do have the foil, which is going to be the Pia and Kiran Nalaar. And our opponent's thinking about whether to attack, possibly thinking about another Eldrazi Obligator, but either way, we are going to be able to send this to a 3rd game. So, here's Pia. And we would like to use this opportunity to sacrifice a Thopter. And here we go. Alright, game 3. So, on the draw, the Fevered Visions aren't quite as good. They were pretty good for us that game, but I still think we want to keep them in. The goggles aren't really necessary, so we could board in a card like Fiery Impulse for the 2-drop creatures, but that doesn't necessarily seem like the best course of action. Yeah, let's just go ahead and stay with the same game plan and configuration. So this is a 2-lander, but we should probably just go ahead and keep it and hope to draw another land. We are on the draw, and we have some of the better cards in the matchup here. We don't have a 2-drop. We haven't really seen Thing in the Ice at all, but hopefully, if our opponent has a slow draw, we'll be able to capitalize on that. Although, here's a Sylvan Advocate, which is going to be able to put some pressure on us. What we'd really like is to have something like a Jace here, but we're just going to go ahead and pass back. We haven't seen that many actual ramp spells. We've seen a bunch of creatures, though, and here's Tireless Tracker. So it looks like perhaps our opponent is going to be able to take us by surprise with this sideboard plan. So we could play Fever Visions here, but I kind of like just going ahead and getting the Jace into play, which we can potentially Fiery Temper something using the Madness ability with Jace, but we are letting our opponent untap now with Tireless Tracker, so that's not great enough. Our opponent has something like Explosive Vegetation, for instance. That would be bad news. But we're just going to go ahead and take the 5 here. If our opponent... Okay, it actually looks like our opponent may be sacrificing a clue to make the Tireless Tracker larger, but we still may have the ability to Fiery Impulse it. But our life total is definitely hurting at the moment. We'll see what our opponent can find off of this Oath of Nissa. Okay, it's just a land with its Sanctum of Ugin. But here's another Oath. Interesting. So yeah, it looks like our opponent's definitely getting more aggressive than we were expecting. And Chandra, that's pretty bad news. So we'll see what we can find off of our Jace and off of our draw step. We actually now drew into Thing in the Ice. We can play it. So let's do it. Let's play it. And try to get it going. We're going to go ahead and loot with Jace. And we're most likely going to want to just go ahead and discard the Fiery Temper to get rid of the Tireless Tracker, even though the Sylvan Advocate is also quite annoying. So unfortunately we haven't drawn our 4th land, so that's gonna definitely hurt us. And Fevered Visions is one of those cards that it can be somewhat bad, as I touched on earlier when on the draw, because sometimes you just don't have time to cast it profitably. And we're kind of seeing that right here, as we've never really had an opportunity where we've wanted to cast the Fever Visions. And so now we are on the back foot. And Nissa's Pilgrimage is going to allow our opponent to now have the Sylvan Advocate get +2/+2. That's annoying. It's also going to mean our opponent is going to have the ability to cast Chandra next turn. If our opponent also is able to keep the Oath of Nissa in play, because remember, Oath of Nissa, even without the 2 mountains, is going to enable Chandra to come down. So, not the best spot, but we'll see what we can find off of this Jace activation. Okay, we drew another Fiery Temper. It's not really what we wanted here, though. Let's just go ahead and pitch this Fever Visions, because we're not really going to have time to play it effectively. What we can do, though, is we can play Jorian, and even though our opponent may play Chandra and take it down, that may be the lesser of two evils in this situation. We're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place. Our land also came into play tapped. And yeah, I mean, some versions of Ramp now do have Tireless Tracker and Sylvan Advocate alongside a bunch of other creatures, but we hadn't seen them in the previous two games, so it's pretty likely that some of these cards are coming out of the sideboard, but we see that this plan is quite good against what we're trying to do. And actually, it looks like our opponent is just cashing in Chandra completely in order to get rid of our Thing in the Ice, as well as our other creatures. And we're left down to this last draw step here to find something. And unfortunately, we didn't really find what we wanted. So the question is, what now? We could play Eldrazi Obligator, steal Sylvan Advocate. That's not that great of a play. Unfortunately, we can't get to the point where we can follow the Titans to kill this Sylvan Advocate. So we can also just play Jace and play Eldrazi Obligator. So that's the play that I'm leaning towards here. And just playing out the Eldrazi Obligator as a chump blocker. It's pretty unlikely to work out the way we want it to, but it's likely to be worth at least a shot. And if our opponent has like another Chandra here, we're just completely dead because our opponent can tick it down, and that could be what's happening. It is going to be Kozilek's Return instead, though, and that's also going to be enough to kill us. So, yep, not a great matchup. We were able to take one game, but here things didn't pan out in our favor, so